Cynthia Ogorek will be talking about the history of Hegewisch. And we had her, I think, 2014, yeah, about 3 years ago.
Year.
The first, yeah. Hi, Tom. Okay. Hi, Rose. So for those who don't know Cynthia, she specializes in Calumet region history and has produced a series of 4 books on the region's transportation history. Her previous books were entitled Along the River, Calumet River. I think that was your first one. The Lincoln Highway around Chicago. Chicago South Shore and South Bend Rail Line. And this is the one I don't have now. Chicago and Western Indiana Railroad. And she has it here in case anyone's interested in taking a look at it. Cynthia is a founding member of the South Suburban Heritage Association. Was that what everyone found? Was he part of that? That was a while ago. Was it?
Probably the early 90s.
The 1990s, yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Okay. And so anyway, we're glad to have her here. And thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
Well, I've been talking back and forth with Kevin all week saying I was getting nervous because I'd be on video, and I think he's the nervous one because he can't get his lenses on.
This thing drives me nuts. This tripod is great when it sets up, but it's got 2 different axes, and I can't get them to coordinate when I can't see what I'm doing, which is most of the time. So it's just, go ahead, Joanne's got you.
All right, okay. A lot of people are wondering about the first slide. But let me just do a little introduction. This is not so much a history lesson about Hegewisch. It's a kind of a virtual tour of the places that I've been to and a lot of the people that I've talked with in gathering the information for the book that I'm proposing to write. Aniston, the reason that book is there is because when I first got the notion to start looking into the history of Hegewisch, of course, you go online. And this is one of the first items that popped up, so I immediately got a copy of it because if it's popping up with a keyword of Hegewisch or United States Rolling Stock Company or Adolf Hegewisch, then I know there's something in there that I should be reading. Just briefly, Aniston, as you can see, they called it the model city of the New South, and it was founded or incorporated in 1873. And the basis of their economy was iron producing, textile manufacturing, and other kinds of industries. In 1883, the Noble Brothers Car, Wheel, and Axle Company moved their plant from Rome, Georgia, to northeastern Alabama, where Aniston is. And then in 1887, the Noble Company decided to sell, and the buyer was United States Rolling Stock Company, which was also the founder of Hegewisch, which you may not know. Well, we'll get back to Aniston. Let's see, I'm supposed to do this. Later on in this procedure, one of the things I also found out in the Aniston book was about a town in Ohio called Urbana. And according to the history of United States rolling stock that was mentioned in the Aniston book, Urbana was the site of the first plant. Rolling stock is freight cars. So these guys were going to produce freight cars, and they came out here to Urbana, which is western central Ohio. And this was also the scene of my first road trip in the name of Hegewisch in 2014. This is a postcard that I picked up at the library or the museum, and this actually is 1920s, and it's about 50 years after Adolf Hegewisch would have visited here. But I'm guessing that, let's see if I can make this work too. This hotel was there during the 1880s when Hegewisch and Hotchkiss and all the rest of the USRSC guys would have been coming through town. They may have even stayed here during the negotiations with the town fathers. The interesting thing about the 19th century and industrialization is that the people in any given town across the country were just as excited and boosterish as any town today. You know, Amazon's going around tickling everybody. You know, we'll put our plant here if you give us a lot of stuff. This is the same thing that was happening in Urbana. Here the town, the well-to-do of the town fathers got together, they chipped in money, they chipped in land, and they offered United States Rolling Stock Company something like 50 acres north of town if they would start construction by a certain date, and if they would complete construction and hire the number of people they said they would be able to hire, then they would get the land for free. Now, you're all wondering why Urbana, Ohio, out in the middle of nowhere, okay? Urbana happened to be on the Erie Railroad line. The United States Rolling Stock Company was a result of a merger between the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad. Atlantic and Great Western was western New York State, Pennsylvania around Erie, and then Ohio. And Erie got as far as western New York out of Hoboken. They needed a route to the west. They needed to get to Chicago. They needed to get to the Pacific Ocean because that's where all the money was to be made. So when this railroad came up for sale, they bought it. And the result was, part of the result was this rolling stock company, because in those days a lot of railroads were building their own freight cars and so forth. All that happened around 1870. And a couple of the names you should know about, General George B. McClellan of Civil War fame was one of the owners. There were like three guys that made up a syndicate. They bought the AGW and then they formed this company. McClellan bailed out within 2 years. He was smart. He got out like in 1871, 72, just when the whole economy was tanking once more, and so he was off with his money and off into Europe. Okay, let's see here. I've got a roster of some of the buildings. When I was doing the research there in Urbana, these are the only photographs that they have left of the company as it was. These are all roughly between World War I and 1925-27. United States Rolling Stock Company went through a lot of reorganizations, and at one point it was also called the Illinois Car Company. This was after 1900 or so. Out here we called it the Illinois Car and Equipment Company. But the signs on these buildings are not quite that long. This is a photograph of a guy working on a wooden boxcar inside the plant at Urbana. And this is the 1880s to about 1910 was the era of the wooden boxcar and wooden freight cars, and somewhere around 1910 the shift to steel is beginning, and that presented a lot of problems for companies like U.S. Rolling Stock. But here we see them putting together a wooden boxcar. And then these are just some exterior views. They told me at the libraries that these were probably taken just before the buildings were demolished in the 1920s. You'll see later that they look somewhat like the stuff in Hegewisch. I like these windows because they remind me of these walls of windows are a lot like the Albert Kahn factories that we had here, like at the Ford Company, and if you go out to see the Lansing Airport, they still have those curtain walls with made of windows. I don't know if you can see this, but I'm really geared into this stuff. But there's the word Wabash is right there, and so we know that they were making cars for Wabash. They had already gotten into the steel car. This is a pressed steel panel on the end wall, and the same thing here. That may be a door. I'm not sure what exactly it is. And luckily enough, they also were doing cars for the Erie. These look much earlier, though. They look a lot more like wooden cars all the way across. Okay. And that my friends, is all that is left in Urbana of the rolling stock company. At least they got a street named for them in commemoration. So while I was there, I drove around what they told me was the former site, and it was back here where these silos are. Today, they say that there's a trailer park or something back here, and I'm not sorry. Back here would be the trailer park, and then there's this agricultural company of some sort in the front. And from what I could determine from maps and so forth, this would have been the same, pretty much the same railroad right-of-way that went into the plant. So the Erie right-of-way was along here somewhere in the olden days. And that's all that's left, with the exception of this little thing.
One question.
Yep.
How large was the labor force?
I don't know. And
No guesstimates?
No. The newspapers were always claiming, 1900, and then when you actually do some math from the city directories, 200, 500, it depended on what the orders that were coming in. I don't know how old that wooden crossing is, but I like to think it's way back to the 1900 or something.
Right, some of those in East Chicago.
Yeah, they're still around here and there. Okay, well, when I'm not on the road, I'm pretty much commuting back and forth here. This is the Calumet Park Field House, and the Southeast Chicago Historical Society is housed right there in the corner, and it was at one time the Chicago Public Library branch for the East Side. It's now home to the James P. Fitzgibbons Museum, and I did a little bit of that. This is looking forward in that room. I'm in the standing in the archives area, and then that's the front desk, and that little desk in the corner, right there, is actually the librarian's circulation desk from 1924, and I think that's really neat. I like wood, so I feel very comfortable in this space. I think I put in something like 2 working years at the Historical Society, reading the newspapers, the Hegewisch News, and when I finally finished going through all the available issues last fall, I counted up, I kept a log, and it came to something like 1,985 editions. And that includes missing years. They don't have 1953. I think 54 is kind of spotty, and the Hegewisch News actually started publication in the late 30s, and those issues are missing. People just didn't save those things. But it's been very helpful in learning about everyday conditions in Hegewisch, and especially from like the 1970s up until 94, which is my cutoff date. There's a lot to be said about the environmental issues and the airport issue, the public library issue, and all the activism that went on in that community. The people were really organized and really out to save themselves. And that was something that just built over time, because this town goes back to the days of Hyde Park Township, when it was an independent settlement, an independent municipality. And from the get-go, they were having to beg for every kind of a municipal improvement. Infrastructure was non-existent, and in order to get it, they had to take committees to meetings and beg for these things that should have been theirs just because they were part of the township. So I won't get too whiny about that, but there's where I sit a lot of the time. Okay, well, interspersed with reading the newspapers and traveling, I've also been using the collection of oral histories that Southeast Chicago Historical Society has collected. Rod Sellers sponsored these interviews in the 1990s, and they took place at what was then the Chamber of Commerce building in Hegewisch on 133rd and Brandon. I shouldn't have been too surprised that a lot of these tapes that I'm listening to were done by people I kind of know. I mean, I recognize a lot of surnames, and I was probably related to some of them distantly. Why I shouldn't have been surprised was because my father was raised in Arizona. My mother was from the other side of the tracks, in Hegewisch, beautiful downtown Hegewisch. So I interviewed as many relatives as well. I've gotten something like 30 or 40 interviews done. And I've also gone into other people's houses and into businesses. And how many of you recognize that gentleman from the back? Mike Condo. This is his family's hardware store on Baltimore. And the reason I came back that day was not to get his back, but to take a photo of the bust here of Tony Pyatt, who was another one of Hegewisch's claim to fame. He was a Major League Baseball player, and don't anybody ask me what team. That'll be in the book maybe, but I'm not going to remember it. The thing about oral histories and interviews is that a lot of times you can compare two versions of the same event, and it kind of gives you like the crosshairs in it. For instance, my aunt likes to tell me that her father, which would have been my grandfather, he had a tavern on the corner of 133rd in Baltimore, and in the summer, in the evenings, everything quieted down, he would take chairs out on the sidewalk, and he'd sit there, and sooner or later, Father Kulinski from St. Florian's would amble by, and they'd sit there and chew the fat and solve all the problems of the world. Well, when I did it, later on, I did an interview of a lady by the name of Sophia Michna. She was a Dirick from home, and her father owned Dirick's Grocery on 135th and Burley. And without any prompting from me, she said, "Oh, my dad used to take chairs outside the front of the store in the summertime, and they'd sit there." But in her case, an organ grinder used to wander through the neighborhood, and they'd give him a few pennies or something, and he'd play, and then he'd move on to the next place. So we know that was a Hegewisch thing, right? For sure now. Well, I also spent my childhood listening to relatives during parties where they played my favorite game, Who Was She From Home? And I have some more pictures here that I forgot. These are just some street scenes from Hegewisch. Joe Block, Frank Lasecki. There's my Uncle Joe. I have to do this more often. I'm not. That's my Uncle Joe, 6th grade. But who was she from home? There you go. These are the Brandis girls from 1919. In 1919, and this game that my family played, they didn't know they were playing it. But, you know, they'd sit around after dinner, and they'd start kibitzing and gossiping and whatever, and somebody would say, well, you know, Mary Hegewisch did blah, 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 blah. Well, that was one sister's version, but the other two, well, who was she from home? And then you had to give her maiden name, and then, oh, okay, and then you knew all the brothers and sisters, the parents, and everything like that. So this is why that was one of the ways I learned Hegewisch history. Okay, we've got another one here. Anybody know what this is?
South Shore.
Oh, wow, everybody's been there. Okay. South Shore Inn was a place that I knew I had to get into because they told me, or somebody told me, that there was a poster of Battling Nelson in that bar. And I kept saying, I have to get in there before they tear the place down and the thing is gone, you know. But I'm not the kind of person who will walk into a bar by yourself, let alone go up to the bartender, who may or may not be the person I really want to talk to, and say, well, hi, my name is Cynthia, I'm a historian, and could you please tell me about the bar, and where's the poster? You know, cold calling is not my bag. Well, about a year ago in January, I did a program at Whiting Historical Society, and a couple days after the program, I got an email from Gail Castalco, and she says, this man called up, he wanted to be at the program, but he couldn't make it. He wants to buy a book. Here's his contact information. So I contacted Mr. John Turman, and a few days later went out to his house in Avalon Trails. He wanted not one book, but two. And we started chattering after a little bit, and I said, well, who's the other book for? And he says, oh, Dean Ubik. And I said, Dean Ubik? And he says, yeah, South Shore Inn. And, you know, the eyelids started fluttering. Oh, would you please take me over there and introduce me to Mr. Ubik? So he was more than happy to, and we went over there, and sure enough, the Battling Nelson poster is there. But there are also a lot of other things hanging on the walls. And I know this is kind of like a commercial for the South Shore Inn, but you really should go there, have a beer, and do a tour of the Hegewisch Museum, the satellite museum here. This is it, right here. He's got this, which is of interest because Ford City would have been the neighborhood behind what they call behind the park. If you're familiar with the local vernacular in Hegewisch, they call that area behind the park. This was going to be developed in the 1920s. Across the nation in the 20s, there was a big building boom. Houses were going up left and right. The only problem is, I guess these guys got in towards the end of it, and they probably were going to lose their shirt. So they were having an auction. I'm assuming this was somewhere around 1930, 1931. And he's also got the flip side of that brochure, and all these the lots in red, I think, are the ones that are available for sale, because if you drive back behind the park today on some of these north-south streets, you will see 1920s era buildings. There are a lot of brick 3-flats, typical Chicago brick bungalows, the whole 9 yards, all you're pretty much right around in here someplace. The Ford Motor Company, as you could see, was here, and then these are, you know, typical houses, I guess, that they were going to build. You can see the flat apartment buildings and everything.
That's Man Park.
Man Park. Yeah, when you say the park in Hegewisch, that's the only one. They have some playgrounds, but Man Park is the park. Okay, so we did get to see, besides Bat Nelson and the housing and so forth, again, I apologize for this photo, but let's see, that's another uncle. This is the Rainbow Athletic Club, and it was a new one on me when I came in here and I saw the caption and was told what it was all about. They also had pictures of this uncle and his wife, who was my blood aunt, sitting at the bar on New Year's Eve. So it's quite a collection of these guys and people and places around town. And there we have the poster of Bat Nelson. He was the world's lightweight boxing champion, I want to say like 1904, 1905. And the next photo is a lot better. This is, I think, from Mike Annual's collection. Nelson is on the left rather, and this is Joe Gans. And I guess when he beat Gans, that's when he became the world champion. Okay, and here he is again. In the center of the photo, he was in Goldfield. It says down there, yeah, Goldfield, Nevada, for another prize fight. The interesting thing about Nelson was that he came back to Hegewisch. You know, championship kudos don't last very long. So when he had to retire, he brought all the money back and he invested it in property in Hegewisch, and then somehow lost it all during the Depression. I think partly the thing was that fighting was extremely brutal in those early days, and he got his share of knocks on the head. And by the 20s, he was not firing on all cylinders, and certainly by 1954, when he died, he was really in bad shape. But it was nice that he came back and tried to do well or do good by Hegewisch. This was his neighborhood. The street is Brandon Avenue. The South Shore Inn would have been over here off of 136. I'm told that they're putting in the streetcar line, so this is dated to somewhere around 1915. I think there's a man down here putting in a sewer or else the underground electric, but I think there must have been trolley lines in there. I don't know enough about this at this point. What I'm trying to say, though, is Bat Nelson lived around here. He lived about 2 blocks down the street, and where the photographer is standing, you know, if I'm the photographer, behind me is the South Shore Station that used to be at the end of Brandon, and off to the right, well, the photographer's right from the station was the entrance to United States Rolling Stock Company. See, I always come full circle. I'm not trying to lead you all astray. The other interesting thing, this was like ground zero, really, for Hegewisch, because you had the entrance to the plant, which was the only game in town for several years. You had boarding houses and restaurants and taverns and, whatever transportation was here on Brandon. And the bars on the bars, barber shops, boarding houses and midwives, doctors, everybody was kind of centered around Brandon and Brainerd Avenue. And what's interesting to me is that behind these houses, you've got streets like Burley and Buffalo and Mackinac, and those neighborhoods were really interesting because they were made up of Swedes, Irish, and Greeks. And in fact, the Greek church is like 2 doors, let's call it east of the South Shore Inn. It's still there on Brainerd Avenue. So it's really a hodgepodge, and like everybody told me, everyone got along.
What were the 3 ethnic?
Pardon me?
What were the 3 ethnic groups?
In that neighborhood, it was more or less Swedish, although Bat Nelson was Danish. Swedish, Irish, and Greek. They had, you remember the photo of the South Shore Inn across the street, there was another little tavern, and then behind that was the Paulus, Greek, and Murphy, Irish grocery store. They got along. Let's see what we have here. Oh, okay. Like I was just saying, they told the gate to the plant was like where you all are sitting, okay? So I go back into the I was still in the tavern, and I'm wrapping up the interview, you know, putting my pencils and papers away and everything, and by now, Mr. Ubik is finally getting warmed up. It takes people a while to start spilling. And he starts talking about, he says, well, you know, back in the 90s, my boy and I used to go across the street in the weeds, and we'd poke around back there, and he says, you know, the gate to the plant is still there. And I almost dropped the pencils because I thought everything was gone. So I ran outside and I took a couple of photos. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd have no idea. This is the gate to the press steel. Here's the uprights, and there's another one back here in the trees, and then these tall things up here are lights. They were those old, you know, mid-20th century where they have the arm and then that little lamp shade and then the bulb hanging down. They're really simple. Talking about getting around, I had more luck, you know, getting on sites in Alabama than getting onto this one. I wrote them a letter. I wanted to get in before they started tearing down the brick buildings, and I think they were afraid that I was a building hugger, and they just ignored me. So I did not get in to see this. However, later on, once everything, they were starting the new construction, Karen and I were allowed in, and then later on I went back again with the alderwoman from the southeast side. So I got a shot of the gate from the inside. And this is why I got pretty excited, and a couple other people got excited. We thought we could rescue this thing and bring it over to the other side and put it in Hegewisch and do a little memorial to the founders of the town. But you can see there are railroad tracks here. These are active. This is on the Center Point development side. And then back here you can see freight cars. And then beyond that would be the South Shore line. So there's no way that you can get in there and play around. Although somebody we know has offered to go in and strip all the weeds when nobody's looking. Anyway, we talked to the builder, the site superintendent. You don't know maybe. Behind us, they're putting up another car plant. That's where they're going to be building. It's a Chinese company going to be building CTA cars. And you know, like I say, we've come full circle. We're still building railroad cars of one sort or another. Anyway, the site guy was here, and he knew what we wanted to do, but he said, I don't know, we don't know if these power lines are live, for one thing. You need a crane to pull this thing out. You need permission to go across all the railroad tracks and get it out to Brainerd Avenue, and then it's your problem. Like, what are we going to do with it? So there were some suggestions, and then the alderwoman kind of dropped out of it, and I was talking to one of her people in the office. He said, well, if you got the money, you can do it. And I said, yeah, I can raise $250,000. Do we have a sugar daddy in the audience? So if somebody is feeling really passionate about Hegewisch, it was a nice project for us. And I'll be happy to write the copy for the little kiosk that will go in front of it. Okay, we got that. Okay, a lot of times my road trips are virtual, and that means I go via the internet. I have found Hegewisch information at UC Berkeley. The New York Public Library has been extremely helpful, and my favorite is Queen's University in Belfast, Ireland. That's where this letter signed by our guy, our hero, Adolf Hegewisch, came from. I was noodling around on the internet, and I came across a website that a man by the name of Barry Henderson had posted. He's a doctoral student at Queen's University, and he's writing a biography of James McHenry, or Sir James McHenry. I'll do this as quickly as I can. Sir James McHenry was one of the big financiers of the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad, and then after this merger with the Erie, he was the backer for the United States Rolling Stock Company. He got the money together. He was selling the bonds and the stocks and stuff in Europe. McHenry was born in Ireland. His family immigrated to the United States. He grew up in Philadelphia. When his father died, he took the family fortune and he went back to Europe. He made his own fortune in Liverpool by importing American dairy products. So then, he's got all this money, and now he gets into railroads. And he pulls strings all over Western Europe. It's absolutely fascinating. So I corresponded with Barry Henderson for a while, and he finally says, well, I can't really tell you any of these things because I'm writing my doctorate, and what's the point if I tell you everything? But I will send you a copy of this letter. Mr. Henderson had been hired by a private family in Belfast to deal with their archives, family archives. You only read about that in English novels, but he knows somebody who really has one. And among those papers were all these papers for James McHenry, and that's what got him started on doing his doctorate on that. This may be the earliest piece of paper, quote unquote, that I have with Adolf Hegewisch's signature on it. He was then assistant secretary of the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad, and he would eventually become president of the United States Rolling Stock. On the flip side of that, sometimes the internet finds me. A couple years ago, the Northwest Indiana Times did a story about what I'm talking about tonight, about my work on Hegewisch. And a few days later, I got an email from a descendant of the man I call Little Adolf. We've got Big Adolf Hegewisch, who founded our town. He had a nephew named Adolf Hegewisch, and this man who contacted me, Eddie Hegewisch, was his grandson. And I thought, oh boy, all my problems are going to be solved. It was like that Aniston book. I thought it was all done, but no, he really couldn't help me very much. But he did, give me assurance that the family did exist and that, the little Adolf was really his nephew and so forth. The interesting thing is that little Adolf a big Adolf didn't have any children. He was married but no children. He kind of took little Adolf under his wing, and in 1884, when Hegewisch, with the plant was just about ready to open, he brought little Adolf with him. So Mr. Adolf Hegewisch of New Orleans was here in 1884. He came back in 1950 at the bequest of certain people in Hegewisch. He was in town on a business trip, and he got on the South Shore, and he came out to see what he had seen when he was a little squirt. And this little Adolf that I talk about, he was a very well-known and well-respected businessman in New Orleans. He expedited imports and exports for various companies down there. Let's see.
Is Hegewisch an English name then?
Oh, no, Hegewisch actually is German. The father came from Germany to Mexico, Veracruz, in 1820. He married a local girl, and they had, I believe it's 5 children. There were 3 boys and 2 girls, Adolf, Gerardo, and Ernesto. And I'm pretty sure Ernesto was the father of little Adolf. The 3 brothers ended up in New York City. and they had this spectacular house on Staten Island, and it just goes on from there. I mean, it's a very interesting family, very interesting history. But when I tell people Adolf Hegewisch was Mexican, they say, what? Well, it's like, I'm American, Polish, Croatian Americans. I'll bet nobody will know. I'm pointing to the wrong thing, I apologize. Nobody knows what this building is, unless you were really observant when you're driving around.
Is it Old Town Cap?
Pardon me?
Old Town Cap.
Old Town Cap?
The 35th of Brady?
Nope. I'm sure you wouldn't guess it. This is the street here. This is Goslin. This is North Hammond. Okay. When you're going east on Brainerd, you cross the railroad tracks and make the first right here. This is Dearborn, and this was Henry Rigby's tavern. Okay, it's typical of a lot of taverns in those days that had a bar and maybe a little eating space in the back on the first floor, and then rooms to let upstairs. This is a lot like what the South Shore Inn looks like, and Steve's Lounge. I mean, all of them had that upstairs kind of thing. The reason I'm telling you about this is that Hegewisch doesn't just end at certain borders, because people move around. They work in different places. They socialize in different places. Now that I finished with the Hegewisch news, I'm over in Hammond reading the Lake County news, and I'm picking up little bits about Hegewisch through the reporters over in Hammond. Henry Rippey owned a lot of this property, apparently, and these houses were there at the time. And they called this the North Side Grounds, and they'd have picnics, they'd have fist fights, they'd have bands and dancing and whatever, in around this tavern, I guess. So people from Hegewisch came. A lot. You read accounts for some of the guys who worked at the car factory. The car plant would come over here for a little relaxation on the weekends or on holidays. There was the people in Hegewisch and in Hammond knew that there was this exchange of working men. It's never good enough to work in your own hometown, right? You have to go somewhere else to really get a good job. In fact, the most famous worker in Hammond was Bat Nelson. His first job was at the packing plant on Holman and or Michigan Central and the river, farther south in Hammond. So at one time, by 1902, the Businessmen's Association in Hammond was trying to get a streetcar line extended along Goslin, and then go on into Brainerd and then into Hegewisch, so that the guys would have some way to get to work without walking. That was even a long walk in those days. But partly, the other part of the reason I'm telling you this is that the land was called the Eschenberg Addition to North Hammond. Okay, Eschenberg has a deep history in Chicago. He had, apparently, from what I've seen in city directories, he did a lot of things before he made his pile, and he got into real estate. He was one of the three major players in the Hegewisch real estate syndicate. Now, I want you to do a little imagination here. If you're standing here in front of Mr. Rippey's, and you're going to walk down Goslin, and then it's going to become Brainerd Avenue, and you're going to get to the car plant, okay? Car plant is over here on the other side of Brainerd and the railroad tracks. The people are living over on this side of Brainerd and the railroad tracks. The United States Rolling Stock Company owned the land for the plant. They did not own the land for the housing. This is not like Calumet. They knew they needed people, that people needed houses if they're going to come to work out in no man's land like it was in 1884, but they weren't going to get into housing. So about, I would say it's like 12 guys got together, doctors, a couple of lawyers, and then the three big players got together and they bought all that acreage for the housing side. And they called it the Hegewisch Real Estate Syndicate. Why they named it after Adolf Hegewisch, I don't know. He was not one of the owners. He was the president of United States Rolling Stock, and he was the administrator of the real estate syndicate. That meant that anything he did, any big deals that he was going to make, he had to have signed off by the three top guys. Three top guys were this J. William Eschenberg, William Rand and Cyrus Royce. I've already told you about Eschenberg. He owned all this other land. William Rand was the president of Rand McNally, which later bought Conkey plant in Hammond, and it became the Rand McNally printing house. And Cyrus Royce was the vice president of the United States Rolling Stock Company, and he had made his claim to fame, he had made his name in lawyering by representing the Lakeshore and Michigan Central Railroad in their suit against the Chicago and Western Indiana, which is a whole other ballgame, but it's all tied into this North Hammond piece of land as well. But anyway, those three guys owned somewhere in the area of 75% of all that land in Hegewisch. And so they were the ones that you had to deal with in order to buy a house or buy a piece of property. The other thing, I was talking about the putting in a streetcar line here. Well, they were talking about that in like 1902. It wasn't too many years before the South Shore actually did it, but it went in behind that building, and there you see it today. The South Shore running towards Hegewisch. There's the right of way to the bridges there. All this used to be houses. And Rippy's Tavern is gone. Everything is gone now because they're planning to turn this into a new station. It's a state line station, parking lots, maybe some housing, that sort of thing. So it's all coming to fruition. What is that, like 120 years later? We work very slowly in the region. Oh, the other thing about Mr. Eschenberg, one thing I forgot to mention was he owned Arizona. He's the one who developed our area of Arizona. If you look on the maps, those streets that we call today Avenue N, M, and L, and maybe K, all had German names. There was a Goethe Street and a bunch of other ones. And so he was going to develop that area. But I think it was 1899, he committed suicide. Don't know why. Wasn't there. Okay, back on the road, I finally made it to Alabama. Remember Anniston, the beginning, Alabama? This was a sister city on the west side of the state. It was on the Tennessee River, and this was my first stop to see the third United States rolling stock plant. And it's just a few miles upriver from Muscle Shoals of country music fame, Alabama, and all those guys. Let's see. At Urbana, I went to the local library first and then to the archives. I'm trying to talk about Decatur. I went first of all to the local archives, and then they sent me to the local library. Then they sent me to the county archives building. And I found a lot of papers that had been signed off on by David Cornfoot. He was the guy who took over the United States rolling stock when Adolf Hegewisch was pushed out. You can see here where the plant was in Decatur. Right there, U.S. rolling stock on the river, similar to what happened in Hegewisch. And then there was more factory over here. Let's see. Just quickly, the reorganization sequence for U.S. rolling stock, it went into bankruptcy due to a lot of extenuating circumstances in 1890, reorganized by 1895 as U.S. Car. Then it became Illinois Car and Equipment, which we saw the signs in Urbana, and then Western Steel Car and Foundry took it over, and that's where we were in Hegewisch coming up. There's a U.S. rolling stock. Let's see, it was 1889. The sad thing about this was that U.S. rolling stock came into Alabama in about 1887, and like 2 years later, they were going into bankruptcy. Everything just went, crazy. The economy turned, their investments turned, and part of the problem was that they were overextended. They had bought this plant, and then I'll show you the Anderson one in a second. And on top of that, they had instituted a car trust program, which meant they owned the cars that they were producing. And so you come in, and it was like rent to own. And then if you defaulted on the rent, U.S. rolling stock kept the car, and what are you going to do with it? It's not making any money for you. So it was just a big mess at that time. Okay, let's see. And on to Anniston. Oh, no, this is still Decatur. This is what's on that site. Again, another Oriental name plant. Is there a trend here? This was U.S. rolling stock in Anniston about the same time. They built both of these plants. They bought the Noble Brothers Car and Axle, Car, Wheel, and Axle Company, and the Alabama Car Company. And they opened up a U.S. rolling stock plant down there. One of the reasons that they built here is because of the crossing of railroads. You know, they up in the north where we are, they had the Erie, they had the Chicago, Burlington, and all these other ones. You know, there's a whole new market down here in the south. Georgia Pacific was running more or less east and west, and then you had the L&N, the Louisville and Nashville coming north and south, which eventually bought into the Monon, and then they had that connection to Chicago. There was a lot of ore. People ask, well, what do you mean about the New South? Places like Decatur and Anniston were actually printing brochures, and they were sending them to all kinds of industrial companies across the country. Come on down here. The weather's nice. They claimed in Anniston it was nicer here than in Chicago, which I can believe them because it's not swampy, it's upland, it's in the hills, you know, it's a little cooler in the summer. And they had ore. All those mountains are loaded with iron ore and all kinds of other chemicals and minerals that you can use to produce various things besides steel and these cars. And what's more, U.S. rolling stock opened this plant and they bought a stand of lumber somewhat north of town. Remember, we're still in the railroad car era, so they needed that lumber, and it's like Standard Oil, you know, buying up and buying across so that they own the whole process, and that's, I think, what these guys were up to. That was the only one. Never mind. And this is what's there now. This is 10th and Glen Addy Street, which was the site of the U.S. Rolling Stock Company, and there's some other, looks like a trans-shipping kind of facility there, and that's what is on the land now. Okay. And back in Hegewisch, this is what the plant looked like around World War I. I've seen another similar photo. I think it's in the book on the South Shore. When they were building the Van Buren Street station downtown, they took a photo of it and it looked like this. And I said to myself, people complain about OSHA? These are accidents just waiting to happen. And how in the world does a regular kind of guy heave pieces of metal that big and just dump them on a pile? It just floors me. I think what they're building here are hopper cars, but don't quote me on that. It's just unbelievably messy. This is the same yard. In the back here is the Grand Calumet River. And again, I believe these are hopper cars. It looks like that. Don't know who the order was for, fortunately, but that's what was going on. And then World War I came along and we stopped making cars and we got into munitions. And I was laughing to myself while I was practicing this. I said, they just look like big bullets to me. Maybe somebody knows what the actual name was for howitzers or cannons.
Barrels for tanks.
They're what?
Maybe tank barrels.
Barrels?
For the tanks, because they produced tanks over there during the war.
Well, you're talking about the wrong war. Yeah, I think they were just making ordnance, munitions in World War I. I'm not sure. But anyway, that certainly was not a railroad car. This is another view of the plant. At the same time, they're having some sort of a rally, and right here on the drum, you can see it says a Western Steel Car Foundry band. So I think I heard talked that they had rallies for bond sales, Liberty bonds, things like that. So that's probably what was going on at the plant. This building back here, I'm thinking this was a brick structure, and I think this is the building that shows up in that photo when little Adolf came back to Hegewisch in 1950. They went out to the plant site and they took a picture in front of a brick building, and I think that's the one. This is what the place looked like a couple of years ago. And I can remember driving, I live in Calumet City. I was coming into Hegewisch, and I can remember crossing the railroad tracks, and I'm always keeping an eye on my baby over there, you know. And something just said, you better take pictures now. So a couple days later, I came out with a camera, and then after that is when I tried to get on the site. I said, I just want to touch it. That's all I want. You know, they wouldn't listen. So we got a few photos you can see. Even in this one, you can see where the bays were. They're all bricked up now. This is where they would push the cars in. It was like an assembly line thing. The typical rolling stock factory would have had a planing mill. They had blacksmith shops. They had paint shops. They had the assembly shops. They would bring the trucks and stuff in, and then bring the body of the car in and lay it down, and then work on it from there. But they got them in and out. There would have been railroad tracks going in those big doors, and then they push the car out on the other side. And we're getting to the end here. Sometimes I simply stumble over information. I went to Anniston and Decatur in 2015. That same spring, I went to a conference in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And you know how conferences are, they have all these little festivities for these site trips. Well, one of them was to Dearborn to Greenfield Village. And I had been in the museum, the Ford Museum there before, and I was fascinated by that huge locomotive. But I didn't really realize that they had a railroad section in Greenfield Village. I walked over there. They have a roundhouse. They have the locomotives. They have mining trains, different rolling stock and engines for mining trains. And then I found it. It's a wooden boxcar. They're hard to find. This was a stock car, and the reason I'm interested in it is because I feel when I get down to actually writing about the company, I'm going to have to tell people what a boxcar is, what's involved in making a boxcar. So I've got this book by John White. He was associated with the Smithsonian Institution, and it's called The American Wooden Railroad Car. And it is, I guess, let's say 12 inches this way, maybe 15 this way, and probably 3 inches this way, and I swear to God it would weigh 6 pounds. That man said there was no information on wooden railroad cars, but he sure found a lot. And so he's helping me through that book decide, you know, what these parts are, what type of car this would have been, and where the wood ended, where the metal started, and so forth. Let's see. So I'm particularly fascinated by doors. There were all kinds of doors to get things in and out of a car. And then, of course, you have the couplings, which were very complicated bits of metal, and they took a long time to develop. After the Civil War, up until 1900, they were still working on these things, trying to get an automatic one. They had some that were put together where these two parts would be joined, and then a guy with his bare hands would come along and slip a pin in the hole, hoping that the cars didn't move while he was doing this. By the 1890s, they were also pretty much requiring air brakes, and I'm pretty sure that's an air brake. And this is a truck. It's the wheels and the assembly, and there's an axle under here, and this whole assembly is called a truck. And it turns out that there was a factory in Hammond called the Simplex Railway Appliance Company. They were making these things, but I have yet to find out if U.S. Rolling Stock was buying from them or not. I don't know where they were getting their parts. And like I said, I stumble across things. This was also on the site. I got around the little guard fence, and I'm taking my pictures before the guard comes and tells me, get out of here. It's a tank car, okay? We can all establish that. And it's going to hold oil. Now I want you to guess where it was made. Whiting, Indiana. Union tank car, 1937. All the way up in Michigan. How it was saved, I don't know, because being a boxcar was kind of a depressing state to be. Let's see. Okay, so finally, this is about the time Karen and I got on the job site here in Hegewisch. All the brick buildings were gone. They were still tearing up probably foundations and whatever else was underground and all this piping and so forth. They took us on a tour of the site. We got to drive all the way around. That's when I got that second shot of the gate from the inside. But I still felt like I was a day late and $1 short. All I wanted was a couple of bricks. Nope. They never called back. Oh yeah, we'll save these things for you. But then they never came around and did it. Let's see. Buildings. And then these two guys looked a little lonely. So I took a photo of that for old time's sake. Don't know what they would have hauled in that kind of a car. And then this is partly the Calumet River that day that we were on the site. You can see how mushy. I always say, after writing that book about the Calumet River, I just tell people we live on a sponge. And there's a lot of groundwater, and some years your house is just rocking and rolling, and other years it's down in the dirt. So you can see it right there by the river. And this is Burnham back here. And this is the channel that goes from Hammond and over through here, and it meets up with the little Calumet on the other side of the lock. And then in terms of the United States Rolling Stock Company and Press Steel, which was the final version of this car company, this is a section of the river that was of importance. In this, imagine 1938, and this channel, it would have come out of Hammond and gone across the front of the property here. This is U.S. rolling stock, let's say. Would have gone across here, and then eventually it would have connected with the Calumet River. Not the little Calumet, but the Calumet River. In 1938, they were getting ready to do the lock. They were redoing the CalSag, and the lock was going to be put in. So they had to move this channel back here, or across Torrance Avenue. And they were about ready to do that when Press Steel went to court to get an injunction and say that if you do that, we're losing our riparian rights. What are you doing with it? It's just causing you trouble anyway. There's water on your property. But anyhow, you have to protect your interests. So at this point, my take on this is that that's why if you look on a map today, or if you're driving around back there, you'll see that there's a little arm of the former Grand Calumet that's left there. Maybe that was to placate Press Steel. But the actual channel goes right around back here and connects with the little Calumet on the other side of Torrance, the other side of Hegewisch Marsh, and then the lock area flows into that, and you go on to Blue Island. So, let's see. Oh, and this is just to show you where I spend most of my time. I'm not always on the road. This is, let's see, this is all Hegewisch all the time, all in here, and more Hegewisch. And those boxes have grown since this photo was taken. That's all the Hegewisch newspaper notes. And then there's more over here. So that's it, except I just wanted to read a couple of quotes for you. Okay, this is a aerial of Press Steel. The town of Hegewisch is back here. This is the gateway to the plant, and there's, I believe that is the South Shore Station, and this should be the South Shore Inn Tavern. And then that's Brandon Avenue. Bat Nelson who lived somewhere around in there. Brainerd Avenue, South Shore, 1940-ish, we would have still had the CNWI running through here, and then the nickel plate is off going around here. This is the test track that they used during the war to test the tanks that they were manufacturing here in the plant. So once again, we're out of the railroad car business, and we're back into military ordnance.
And the river hasn't been changed yet.
Oh, yeah, it is, yeah. Here's that
That's
little arm I'm telling
section,
you about,
yeah.
and this is the new channel back here. It came off of about 130th Street, and went off down here, and then this is still the Grand Calumet, and it connects with the Little Cal.
Yeah.
Here. I'm gonna say, we're out of the railroad car business, and truth be told, by the time the Depression was coming to an end, sort of, at 38, 39, they were about ready to fold up anyway. They just weren't getting the orders, and so when the government contracts came in, I think they were very happy. The people here, if they were working there, were very happy. They had a job for another 4 or 5 years. And then it's interesting that the missing Hegewisch newspapers at the Historical Society cover the years when this plant would have been closing. So I haven't ever found any, local anxiety or commentary on it. But that's it, as the little pamphlet at the museum says. That's Hegewisch in a nutshell. I'd just like to read a couple things here, paraphrasing from that American Railroad freight car book that I was talking about. He said, "There's no romance about a freight car. They were usually plain and huge and functional. Shippers saw them as free warehouses, and tramps thought of them as their own palace cars. Freight trains slogged unnoticed across the landscape of America with their broad, dull red sides like a chain of billboards moving slowly across the land. A boxcar, by definition, was as ugly as a mud fence. Yet it was one of the greatest money makers of the 19th century. And you have to wonder, of what use would a locomotive have been if it wasn't pulling freight cars? It would have just been tooling around like Thomas the Tank Engine." That's it. Any questions? Or discussion? Yeah, okay.
When you showed the picture of Brandon Avenue with the streetcar tracks,
Yeah.
right after, you also had the picture of the three Brandis girls.
Yeah.
Okay, the girl in the middle is my grandmother.
Who was she from home?
Helen Brandis, right?
Helen Brandis, okay.
And her sister Louise had a tavern right about where those streetcar tracks were. It was called the Flying Saucer.
Okay.
It was on Brandon. And when their father came to the United States from Poland, Brainerd Avenue was called Howard Street.
Right.
I cannot place exactly where he came on Howard Street, but it was in Hegewisch, Illinois. Mm-hmm. And I can't find any relations over there, so I don't exactly know what house he landed in when he got here.
That's hard to say because you can't peg them like on the north, south, east, west streets on Brainerd. It's all.
The numbers aren't legible, and I can't. I was looking at all the censuses trying to figure out who lived in that area, but I can't find the family relationship.
Maybe it was in a
people,
boarding house.
I mean, censuses and stuff, people moved every 6 months or every year. They didn't necessarily
My
stay
mother
for.
said her father moved every time it was time to paint.
There you go.
But he might have been living in a boarding house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's hard telling. I was just trying to put it together, and I was never able to.
Anybody else?
When is your book coming out?
All these people in the corner keep asking that. My goal is to have the manuscript done around this time in 2020. But by the time it would be edited, go through a publisher, I don't know. I really don't know, and it's just, everything keeps getting in the way, like washing dishes and going to sleep and making these trips, and you know, it's a lot of work and time. I can't tell you. Any other probing questions?
Well, just real quick, Cynthia, you said that was it your father who was from Arizona?
Yes.
Well, of course, I wasn't thinking about that section of Hegewisch at the time. So, which Arizona? The Arizona in Hegewisch, or the Arizona in the southwestern part of the U.S.?
No, the Arizona in Hegewisch. Yeah. I should put, when I say it, the quotes come out right. Yeah. You know, the other side of Avenue O, Avenue N.
Okay.